things like this in order to make sure I have the view of Teams. Okay. Okay, so since we don't have much time, I will start the presentation. Yeah, and be happy to give an introduction to the work that IHIP is doing and the work that within IHIP the Shelter Contract Committee is working on. So I'm first going to go through a little bit of an overview of what IHIP is about. So IHIP is the International Humanitarian Infrastructure Platform. I'm François Bayon. I'm the Managing Director of IHIP. And I'm happy to have the opportunity today to give this introduction session. I'll try to follow up as well what is in the chat, but I'm not sure I'm going to be able to do both. So if you have any questions, just feel free to stop and say, and take the opportunity to ask your question, even if I don't look at your chat, because sometimes the chat and the presentation are kind of difficult to manage altogether, but I'll do my best. I'll be the only speaker for you today. And yeah, and I've been around at the, I don't know if I met some of you. I did met some of you in real life, but yes, since the COVID session, then it's all online. But I remember being around in Geneva last time in November, a year and a half ago, and very happy to be have the opportunity to have this session, this well, it's not the official program, but this online session, which is a side meeting to explore a little bit more what IHIP is doing. Last time, I don't know if people were there at the last Global Shelter Cluster meeting, I had IHIP had like a 5 to 10 minute presentation in the plenary session at the end of the meeting. But today, thanks to the Global Shelter Cluster, I can go a little bit more in details and have an introduction to what IHIP is doing. So IHIP is an NGO. It's a Swiss-based NGO based in Geneva. It's 3 years old now, and it's addressing the need of the humanitarian organizations to engage with the private sector in larger and complex infrastructural projects. And the primary focus is to harmonize private sector approaches to be applied in the countries you're working in, subject to fragility, conflict, and violence, and mainly through the forms of contract for construction. I'm not sure you're familiar with this fragility, conflict, and violence, but it comes from the development sector. So IHIP is a bridge between development, humanitarian, and private sector organizations. And it's addressing, trying to procure tools to engage with the private sector, contractual tools, administrative tools, procurement tools. And the current partnership is the official partnerships, the logos that we're able to use today is we have a strong partnership with ICRC, with the Water and Habitat Department. We have a collaboration as well with the WASH cluster, and the funding and the support comes from the Swiss Agency for Development. And the driver of IHIP is basically that the donors, so either the humanitarian donors and the development donors, like the World Bank, for example, are asking the humanitarian response and NGOs and partnership to scale up in order to address 3 major changes that are around. They've been around for the last 10 years, but mainly driven by climate change. So climate change is hitting hard the way we need to design and think and answer and address some of the issues that are happening in the humanitarian world. And the one we're talking about is the urbanization of the humanitarian response, meaning we're moving from a little piece of construction work to this expectation that the humanitarian sector can build cities in the middle of the desert to host a very large number, a growing number of displaced population. And all of this has to meet I guess you all know, which is the Sustainable Development Goals, which is a very strong driver in the development world, and also in the humanitarian, but not as much. But all those three factors are, for the donors, are kind of driving them to say, well, how do we equip, do we give the tools to develop stronger, more complex infrastructure? And the reality there is that it takes the help of the private sector to actually design and build and operate those infrastructure. All of this is we operate, and of course, when we change, we need to innovate. There's a space for innovation in the procurement tools, as well in the technology we're going to use, and there are new actors. Of course, the local private sector is jumping in. Also, we kind of expect to have more engineering, more technical solutions, and more experimented contractors, and a collaboration between local contractors, local engineers, local private sector, and international engineering and private sector. And of course, all of this, both the innovation in terms of size and scale, as well as in technology. We talk about smart cities here. So how do we use the smart cities concept, and then how do we adapt this? We don't have to do it now, but on the long run, how do we include smart technologies in designing humanitarian infrastructure? And all those new actors and innovation equals new risks. So when there are new risks, we're interested in de-risking this environment. So how do we identify those new risks, and how do we mitigate those risks to allow the sector to engage with innovative approaches and innovative technologies? So this is where there is this knowledge gap between the NGOs or humanitarian actors on engaging with private sector. Of course, there is already a relationship with the private sector, and it's all about building on this relationship, but there is this expectation that the private sector should be even more engaged in the future. And as the projects are bigger, we need bigger teams on the private sector side, as well on the NGO side, or humanitarian actors. So when we design, when we sign, when we have a project, we usually have a kind of a partnership or deal between the channels. So who is giving the funding, the private sector. Oh, sorry. It seems. Can you hear me again? Hello?
Yes, Francois, we hear you.
Okay, because I had a. Okay, so I'm back then. So I'm not sure where it stopped to broadcast my conversation. Okay, anyway, I continue. I was just talking about the partnership. So a good project is a good partnership between the funding, so the donors, the implementing agencies, what we call either the NGOs, either local or international organization, the humanitarian organization in general, and how this humanitarian organization is going to engage with the private sector to deliver. And all of this, the common agenda this is all signed into a contract. So once the project is agreed between the donor and the NGO, then it's going to be signed with the private sector to actually build the contract. So here we're talking about construction contract, construction works. So the project of IHIP, why IHIP is around, the mandate is we're focusing on how the contracts, the form of contract of construction that parties are going to sign, how this is a de-risking tool. How do we can make the most out of this contract to make sure that it's going to help all of those new risks to be allocated to the right party able to manage that risk. This is done because IHIP is building on the experience and the knowledge that comes from a famous federation that is already working on those contracts, not in the humanitarian sector, but in the like Occidental private sector, which is FIDIC. FIDIC is the International Federation of Consulting Engineers, and they've designed, they've edited, published since the last 50 years a family of documents that are known as the FIDIC forms of contract, which are used all around the world in been harmonized to actually match the context of the development actors. So the multilateral development banks, they took that contract and they harmonized it, meaning they changed a little bit of what was needed to change to make it adapted to the development context. And IHIP is doing the same thing for the humanitarian, meaning we're harmonizing those existing best practices in the construction contract context. We're harmonizing this to make it adaptable and useful for the humanitarian sector. And today, that work has started like a year ago, and we've been starting the work with the cluster. Each cluster, well, the first one was the Global WASH cluster, and we've done that work with the WASH cluster. And today, so I'm going to present a little bit the result of that work. And today, we're currently doing the same work with the shelter cluster. So you guys, I hope if you're on board, you're kind of connected to the shelter and settlement infrastructure. So we're doing the same thing. We're contacting, taking feedback, collecting best practices, and making this into, converting this into a document, a form of contract, which is matching the reality of what the shelter sector is actually facing at the moment and how it can scale up to engage with more complex infrastructure work. And we're doing all this based on an existing form of contract, which is well-known worldwide, which is this FIDIC form of contract. And here on the screen, we have maybe the most famous one for you guys, which is the short form of contract. Just to mention that earlier in the this annual meeting, there was a presentation from the construction group, construction standard guide, and there is a reference to that document as the best way to deliver infrastructure and use the right contract, referring to the FIDIC form of contract. And I guess, but I'm not sure, it's supposed to refer to the IHIP form of contract as well. So the past cycle, cycle one for the WASH sector, was this survey that we've circulated to the Global WASH cluster back in July. And then out of this survey, there was also the request to get some experts from the WASH sector to jump in the WASH contract committee and to explore how we could make the most out of this survey and compile the result, consolidate the result into particular conditions of contracts, which were released in November 2020, so about half of a year ago. And this is the result of the work in a very summarized way of the work that has been proposed, which results in 18 improvements in the way the form of contract is addressing risk allocation. So we talk about better contract management, improved risk allocation, and improved procurement. And some of them are employer-friendly, some of them are contractor-friendly, some of them are humanitarian specific, and there's only one which is actually WASH specific. So all of this, all together, is the first result of the work IHIP has been doing, dedicated to the WASH sector. But as you can see, there's only one element which is WASH specific, which was about like underground physical conditions, which is typical when you like need to dig the ground to put some water pipes, but not relevant, for example, not so much to the shelter sector. If you're interested, it's very good as a starting point for whoever is happy to jump in to get this copy on the IHIP website. So you have the URL here. You can get your copy, WASH particular conditions. And we're actually doing the same thing now for settlement and shelter sector. So we've circulated a survey to the global shelter cluster members back in November 2020. We had the creation, the setup of the shelter contract committee. So we have 8 members of that committee, which is a mix basically of practitioners from the NGO sector, from the donor side. So we have USAID on board, the Bureau of Humanitarian Aid. We have Save the Children. We have some academics as well on board. We have UNHCR, UNICEF, and there is also a private sector engineering firm that is on board, and a FIDIC drafter expert on conditions of contract, harmonizing conditions of contract. So all this, we had to do another survey in February because we didn't have enough response on the first one, and it was kind of maybe too long. And we consolidated those answers, and I'm gonna go through the result of that consolidation work now. So I'm just looking at the chat, seeing if we have some questions here. Does this include accountability mechanism? No, not yet, but maybe it could in the future. The one thing about the contract is that it has to be generic and it has to be simple as well, so that it's not too long, and of course, something that the contractors on the ground can actually grab. And there's not so much of a contract appetite on the ground, so it's meaning it's work in progress to make sure that the contract is fit for purpose and covering the risk, but not being too complicated. So here on the screen, we have 61. We got 61 answers with a quite well spread out public that did participate, and either both from the NGOs or international NGOs, a few donors, the Multilateral Development Bank, some private sector, and others, which are usually a mix of freelance and private sector people as well. And usually it's worldwide. So we have a geographic representation as well as from the position of each of the people who answered the program, the survey. So from those results, we've listed 21 improvements that are actually listed here. So it's work in progress. We're still thinking about what we're going to do, how we're going to consolidate this, if we're going to keep all of those improvements in the form of contract. So the first one is, we've split it as for the WASH conditions of contract, we split this into 3 categories: better contract management, better risk allocation, and better procurement. And as well, trying to indicate if it's employer friendly, contractor friendly, humanitarian specific, or shelter specific, just to show that it's not a good contract is a contract that is not in favor of one party. A good contract is a contract that helps the dialogue mechanism to actually be more efficient, and then that the information is circulating as much as possible. Before I jump into the details here, is there any questions about what IHIP is doing and how a contract could be relevant to what you guys are doing? Anyone wants to ask us something?
Yeah, Francois, I have one question, one clarification.
Yes.
Yeah. Francois, thank you so much, and thank you, colleague. My name is Fofana Musa. I just want to know, when you said large and complex infrastructure, this is linked to the size of the project, or it's a security issue, budget, or technical requirement?
Well, I guess it's yeah, the complexity is something that is not very well defined. So there's not like a simple project and then it goes to complex with something with a threshold that is easily and universal for everyone. So complexity is, of course, a combination of delays, how long the project is planned for. Is it like 1 month or 2 years? Budget and size in terms of how much volume is it addressing. So is it, if it's for the shelter, I guess it's how much buildings or how much people are going to be hosted by the infrastructure. There is a current the current threshold that is used usually in the private sector is more budget connected, and there is yeah, the first limit is very small project will be under 10,000. That's a very small project, and because it's going to be too complex. Then the other threshold is 100,000. 100,000, well, maybe 50,000, then you need a contract, some kind of already a robust, an existing contract at that point between 50 and 100,000, and maybe a delay of 6 months, maybe even 3. And then that contract should be as simple as possible. And this is where the short form of contract we're talking here is actually relevant. And then we can use that form of contract, well, depending on who you're talking to. It could be either 2 million in terms of budget, or it could be either 5 million, or sometimes it's like 10 million. But then you move to another type of contract, which is the one we're talking about here is like 10-page long. And then when you move to 2 million, you move to a contract which is going to be like 80 pages, way longer. So that's the kind of the budget is kind of the indicator that is used to say, well, you should use you don't have to use a contract, you should use a contract, and then you should use a very like robust contract because of that number. So yeah, that's the most agreed indicator that we're using in terms of measuring complexity. Is that addressing your question?
Yeah. Thank you so much. Because single shelter can be complex in some context. When you take, for example, in South Sudan, where all material are transported by air to construct a shelter, it can be complex. And when some DRC, for example, its road is complex, not the shelter. That is why when see the if it's a link to the site or security. But thank you so much. It is well noted.
But yeah, you're right. Thanks for addressing this, because the first survey that we've circulated to the community of the shelter cluster member was very shelter-centric in terms of wording. And then we've realized that actually the shelter cluster is an umbrella organization for like larger work than just shelter. And it's more about settlement construction work, which is including, as you're saying, maybe sometimes roads or network connections that will bring all different resources or connect the shelter work to the outside world. So yeah, we're more talking about settlement infrastructure, and which could be of course complex, and the expectation is that it's going to be more and more complex. And because this is where the urbanization of that sector is a trend, of course, being driven by the fact that there is the volume of displaced population is not going to go down, well, not at the moment. So the trend is how do we build more complex and more integrated solution? We could say a smart settlements even at one point, where we have technology that will jump in, and this is where technology is usually driven by or managed or engaged by the private sector, which and sometimes the international private sector, and we can talk about how we can transfer technologies as well between international and local private sector. So that question is actually at the heart of is being signed legally. It's binding for parties to actually make sure that each of the parties is responsible for its part. And how do we make sure that this dialogue between the humanitarian sector and the private sector is fluid and that there is the trust all along the chain, and how do we use this as a platform to actually have more services or more advice that are coming from the consulting sector. But that's another story. But it's how do we put smart, intelligent technology in the design of humanitarian response, and how do we bridge those gaps, and how do we on the long term channel some private sector funding, because at the end of the day, de-risking all of this will be attractive to private sector funding, which will make the humanitarian response the first step to the development response, and then to a larger financing mechanism from what we can call impact finance, which is the private sector money. Any other questions? Okay. Okay, so I guess we have 15 minutes left, so that's plenty of time. It's very good. So I'm just going to go quickly through the 21 improvements here, which are not final. This is work in progress. It's where we're at, and I'll be happy to get, of course, feedback from the audience if there's any suggestions on how this could be relevant or not, or improved. So and they're listed. There's no like, it's not the first one that is more important than the last one. It's just the way it's addressed in the contract, actually. So the first one is about force majeure. So there is actually, of course, related to the COVID situation, but in general, the humanitarian context is a more dangerous context than what is usually addressed in forms of contract that are outside of the humanitarian sector. So do we need to make force majeure more specific and more defined about the humanitarian context? The good thing when we do this is, of course, that each party is more aware of what is in force majeure, but the counterpart is that if it's not described, then maybe it could be considered as being not force majeure. For example, the COVID situation, the pandemic situation, is not defined as a specific force majeure, but it's since it's an element that is outside of control, with a very large generic definition, which is not precise, then it says whatever is out of the control of the parties and disturbing the project and uncontrollable is called force majeure. If we go too much in details, we're going to lose that ability to embrace whatever is not planned. So currently, the discussion is do we need to make it more specific or not? So that's the point. If anyone wants to contribute, maybe you can either leave a little message on the chat box because it's being tracked down. I can access this afterwards. We can look at your comments, or jump in the conversation if you want. We also have this requirement to have more of the contractor able to control, to have control on the project and be able to what we call do whistleblowing, is alerting the employer on the fact that maybe the original design or planning or intention is not adapted to the local situation. So giving a little bit more of the power or opportunity to the contractor to actually alert the employer being the NGO. I'm not sure if everyone is familiar with the terms, but yeah, employer is the NGO that is going to pay the contractor. So this additional clause about calling whistleblowing, we have this request or this about subcontracting. We're trying to also make sure that subcontracting is like controlled or framed into a legal environment which is stopping the contractor to dilute the responsibility into subcontracting to a subcontractor with different levels. So we're limiting this to only one level of subcontracting, and also in order to make sure the project is on track and that the money goes to the subcontractor, if any, we're also having an additional clause which will stipulate, which is called payment to third party, which will stipulate that the employer has the right to make sure that the money is actually delivered to the subcontractor and make sure the contract the project is always on track and not being stopped because the money is not delivered to the subcontractor. We also improved the monitoring of the project. The monitoring meaning the kind of discipline that each party has to follow to make sure there is some kind of a tracking of progress. So it's a very simple clause which is called progress report, which is something that the donor likes because it makes the accountability of the project. And maybe this is back to the Vicky's question earlier about accountability mechanisms. It's part of this, but I'm not sure if it's if it's PSHEA compatible. So this is, I'm not familiar enough with this terminology to answer that question, but there is accountability there, or monitoring or progress report. We also have an additional clause to, it's twice here, sorry, the payment to third party. Have included a little bit of operation and maintenance mechanism if ever needed. So just a little small clause that will give the basics of any kind of need for operation and maintenance after the infrastructure has been delivered, which is an optional clause. And we also have included a payment mechanism, which is not a monthly payment mechanism. It's another one which is based on 4 levels of payments. So there is initial payment, there is payment once the project is completed, then there is once the project has been tested, and then the final payment for the. So we kind of propose a 4-step payment mechanism, which is makes it more simple for the humanitarian system. Then we move to the improved risk allocation. So the main item here that is being discussed is accessing the site. So before the works are started, which is at the beginning of the project, which is humanitarian specific. And I think it's specific to the shelter because we didn't talk about this in the WASH cluster. It's how do we make sure that the site is cleared. So there is the mitigation of that risk is the way it is now is that the employer is responsible for the access to the site and the site clearance, meaning removing everything that is on the site and that should be is stopping the work to begin. So that's the responsibility of the employer. If we dig into this, it could be actually a specific task that should be even considered to be contracted to another contractor to do that work. It could be a very large piece of work. And the current discussion during this work is how do we recycle the material that is on board, and how do we make sure that is something that is within the sustainable development goals, and that we're treating any kind of pollution on site as well. So that's a major item we're looking at the moment. And for example, we know the Bureau of Humanitarian Aid is actually looking at the entire supply chain of project to actually figure out where are the spots where we need to make sure that in order to meet sustainable development goals, that we are changing the way we work. So that point about site clearance is and the provision of site is actually a key element before even the work starts. Then the second point is making sure that the contractor does its job and that he's paid once the mobilization of the site is finished, and that this initial payment only starts when the contractor has done its job to move everything that is needed to start the work on site. So that's in discussion as well, but mobilization and site clearance are 2 key elements where the risk has to be splitted, and also the financial risk in case the access to site is delayed too much. Then it's kind of outside of course, the NGO's control. If it's too much delayed, then there is, at the moment, the contractor has to wait. He cannot, even if it's delayed, then the NGO is not going to pay for that delay. So that's the current way where the risk is splitted at the moment in this particular point of the project: mobilization, site clearance, access to site. And then there is this question as well about the reputational risk, which is a risk that mainly the NGO and the donor is taking. They're taking that risk together. So how do we, that reputational risk is of course connected to a project that will be perceived as unsuccessful and not being addressing the right needs or in a bad way. And it's very difficult to, of course, avoid totally. That risk is always there. But one of the ways to mitigate that risk is to... sorry, yes? Hello? Okay, sorry. I thought somebody wanted to say something. Anyway, we have 5 minutes left, so I'm going to be a little bit quicker to finish. So yeah, the right for the employer to inspect and audit the contractor's work, and then as well to have a code of conduct that is also included, so to be taken on board by the contractor and the subcontractor as well. And yeah, there's also a risk about the testing period. So sometimes it's another risk, but sometimes the testing period is very long, and then the contractor is not paid until the testing period is over. So that's that was specific to the WASH sector. Maybe it's not so much in the shelter. We're discussing this, but this is where we're splitting the payment mechanism. So the contractor is paid a little bit of the project, even if the testing is not completed. And moving to the last one, the environmental risk. There's a lot of environmental risk jumping in. So at the moment, the environmental risks are supposed to be addressed by attaching a list of those risks and how to manage this as the code of conduct. It's kind of a guidelines that comes from the NGOs that the contractor should take on board. There is a little bit of a discussion about intellectual property, who owns intellectual property on the document. So that's kind of something that is very maybe more legal than actually on contract management. So we've added 2 clauses that make it clear who owns what and how a project can be replicated or not, depending on who owns the intellectual property. We've added a little bit of quality insurance to make sure that there is the quality is something that is included in the project management. So quality control and quality assurance, both, well, the discussion is do we make all this a contractor responsibility, or we split it between the employer and the contractor? The contractor should, of course, control that the quality is right and make sure that it's fine, and then the assurance to be from the employer to actually double check that this is correct. But we're discussing this. We've removed the retention money mechanism to make it more simple. This is still in discussion. There is this idea that retention money is not is misleading in terms of creating trust and kind of putting some kind of it's disturbing the dialogue, so it might not, and making it more complicated. And then, yeah, we're also addressing the fact that there is, specifically in the humanitarian context and in the annual funding cycle, this risk that the end of the project might because it's delayed, might be outside of the original funding period from the donor. And how do we manage that risk? So part of that risk is for the NGO to manage with the funding partner. And the other one is to make sure that the contractor does all what he can to stay within the funding period. So there's like 2 sides to it. And the last one is about site safety, to make sure that it's specific to the humanitarian context. I guess we have like 2 minutes left. I'm not sure how much of the time we need to yeah, if we can like have a little bit more of a discussion after that, but yeah, maybe just to let you all guys know, we're gonna circulate those conditions to whoever is interested to review them. So it's the moment for you, if you're in an organization that is actually interested to have a look on those conditions of contract to see how it could match your context. This is the moment to send me an email and say, hey, I'm happy to review, to be what we call a friendly reviewer. A friendly reviewer means that you're going to look at the work we're doing, the proposal we're doing in terms of forms of contract, and see if you have any remarks or any suggestions to improve what we're delivering to the sector. And if you don't want to do anything, just read, and then you don't even have to answer. Of course, it's good if you do, but it's a consultation work, but yeah, you don't commit to anything. That's my point. So we're very good. We're very happy to engage with you guys. And if you don't have the time, then that's fine. I guess I'm done now. So if there's any questions in the 2 minutes we have left. Okay, there's some questions in the chat. Yeah, yeah, child labor, of course. Yeah, payment of bribes, proper tendering. Yeah, due diligence. All of this is best practices which are included in the code of conduct. You're right. So yeah, it's included in the. Yeah, all of this is part of course, limiting the space for corruption is a strong issue driving the way a contract is built, and that's originally included in the work that FIDIC has done for 50 years. So limiting space for corruption and bribes, that's for sure. Our conditions only talking to subcontractor level. There should be conditions regarding payment to the community workers if they have hired, and local suppliers, payment by contractor. Yeah. Okay. So this is what we're addressing in having this third party payment mechanism. Maybe it can be included. Where is it here? It could always be improved. So we're taking the best practices that are actually available in the contract forms that is circulating around to actually address this issue of payment to local suppliers by the contractor. Maybe a last thing is this is work in progress. So we're looking for at one point to have the early adopters of the contract giving feedback, and it's supposed to be updated on a regular basis, and to make those conditions adapting to the context. Meaning, if the clause that we're proposing are to be changed or updated, and they will, then there's going to be a next version of the contract. And the goal of IHIP is to have a humanitarian form of contract. So it's not either the shelter and the wash work we're doing now is to make sure we're connected to the context and to and have like a real connection to practitioners on the ground. But the goal is to have one generic form of contract for the humanitarian sector in general, overarching all the clusters. And that's the fine line between generic conditions that can be shared as an element of a reference element for all the sector, and making those general conditions particular to your own context. This is where we have like kind of a optional mechanism of what is fit for purpose in terms of clauses for your context and what is not. Yeah, that's the work IHIP is doing this generic harmonization work, making it simple and at the same time one size fit all as much as possible. But although we know it's not possible, so this is where there's like space for general conditions and then very particular to your project. Yes, I don't know if there's any more questions. So feel free. I'll put my email address again here. Sorry, up. sure why it moved away. Yeah, we're releasing the harmonized version. The work the contract committee is doing, the shelter contract committee, is going to be finalized in the next month, and we're going to at that point circulate our first version to the friendly reviewers, and that's the moment where if you're happy to engage or contribute, it's the right time. And of course, IHIP is looking forward to engaging with your organization as much as possible. So yeah, that's the right timing for you guys, and this is the goal of that presentation. So if there's no more question, then I would like to thank the Global Shelter Cluster team for hosting those annual meetings and those online sessions, doing all the communication work and giving us the opportunity to connect to each other and to know more about what each of us are doing. And hoping to see you in the coming month or weeks to get your reaction or contribution to that work.
Thank you.
Okay, great. Is that fine? Are you?
Yep, that's fine. I'll close the meeting now and see people online for our next open space session by USAID in about 10 minutes.
Yeah, I know. Thank you very much. Thank you, everyone. Bye-bye. Thanks for listening.